As we get into this tonight, Genesis chapter 39, I entitled this "Operating in Your Zone," and I thought about titling this "Staying in Your Lane," but that really didn't work. But really, there are different zones in life that we've been placed in, and I think that there's enough zones that you've been placed in your life that this would make sense. So operating within your zone. If you think about it, and even in the driving yesterday, there's a lot of flowers along the roadway. They're orange, and they're in the middle of the road, and you have to watch out for them. Now, have you ever tried to run into those? You shouldn't, but have you ever struggled, and have you been one of those that have knocked those cones over? You ever see the cones knocked over in the middle of the roadway, and you think, what happened to that person? Did they fall asleep, or did they think that they just get points for it, or what was it that caused them to veer over? And you think of all the equipment. Can you imagine driving down the interstate and going at the speed you are, and then all of a sudden veering over into the zone that you're not supposed to be going? Those are supposed to be a warning for you. Don't go into this zone. This is a zone that we've created for you. But do you always enjoy your zone? Have you ever thought about that? Has anybody complained about the bridge construction in Taylorville? Do you ever just sit there and say, why doesn't it let me go? Why can't it just let me go? And then you realize, well, the other people are all saying that too, and we start getting into it, and it's like, have you ever watched how people disobey those lights? And you're like, oh man, you're crazy. There was one night when I was going across the bridge, I was doing what I was supposed to be doing, okay? I just want to preface this, all right? I was going across the bridge, trying to get out to Bert and Eddie, and somebody decides to disobey that stoplight, and they decided to drive, and they were on the bridge with me, and I just stayed there until they backed up all the way. I wasn't moving. I was stubborn as all get out because I was in my zone and they were not, all right? And it's like I waited for 15 minutes for me to cross this bridge, get off my bridge, all right? And we understand our zone and we have to operate within that. And when we don't, then there's problems. You think of, okay, maybe you don't have struggles with the roadways and maybe you don't complain, you just do your thing. But even in zones, when you think about it, even in the workplace, you've got your zone, right? Have you ever tried to operate as a supervisor when you're not a supervisor? Has anybody tried to do that to you when you were the supervisor? Is that frustrating, or you just love it? All of a sudden, we know that there's a clash because they're trying to operate outside of the zone that they've been given, because we tend to be discontent where we are. Even on a basketball court, some of you are looking forward to the basketball season coming up. Some of you like to watch that game over and over. I don't find as much enjoyment out of that as some of you do. Okay, don't separate from me. I like to play the game. Really don't like to watch it. Okay, but if you want to invite me over to watch a game, I'll watch it with you. All right. So don't separate with me on that. But when you think of it, there's two different types of defense. Okay, at least there was back in my day. Yes, I just used that term. There was man-to-man, and then there is zone. Okay. Now, man-to-man, you stay on your man, and you got to stay with them. And then if you can't, you got to communicate to the other person that's there. Maybe there's a pick or something. Hey, switch, and you got to get to the other guy. A zone, you got to watch your zone. You ever notice that there's some basketball players like to play the whole entire court, and they think that they are the stuff? And you watch as the team falls apart because they don't operate within their zone. You get what I'm saying? What I'm trying to communicate to you in this operating in the zone. When we come into this tonight, listen, Judah. You remember Judah last week? We're not going there again, okay? That was a crazy enough chapter. okay? But if you think of him and how he was in his circumstances and in the zone that God created for him, he decided that he wasn't going to operate within the zone that God gave him. But then we're going to jump into Joseph here tonight, and we're going to see the exact opposite of how Joseph decides to accept his circumstances and to operate within the circumstances that God allows in his life. Like, this is your zone. And in the words that Mrs. Tippett used, do you remember in her testimony after the missions trip, the phrase that she just kept saying over and over and over again? Bloom where you're planted. That's exactly what he's going to do here tonight. So when we think about this, you'll find the difference between Judah and Joseph. So please hone in on that, and then we're going to apply that to your zone as we go through it. So let's jump into this into verse number 1. It says, "And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither." Now, the difference there between Judah and Joseph is what? When you're in this situation, we understood in the last chapter that Judah decided to leave of his own volition. But in the chapter before that, we found out that Joseph had actually been sold. Listen, he was brought down. He didn't voluntarily go down to Egypt. He was sold into slavery by his brothers, and that the transfer was done by his extended relatives. Can you imagine being sold by your brothers, and then your third cousins come in and they mediate the transaction? It's like, wow, talk about family from this morning. But these Ishmaelites connected with the family go in and they make it happen. They brought him down. It's a voluntary leave of the family from Judah, where he isolates himself from the family that God has set to prosper and has given the promises to this family. Judah voluntarily walks away from that, but yet Joseph is taken out. He has no decision in this. He's just placed within Potiphar's household. And so how does he handle it? How does he handle the circumstances versus what Judah was dealing with and what Joseph is dealing with? Well, this is what he does. He accepts them. Simply put, you say that's way too simple. And yet, this is the exact point that we need to be able to come to here tonight. How many times do we struggle with accepting our circumstances? In the last week, have you complained about living in Illinois? In the last week, have you complained about the leadership of Illinois, of the United States of America? Teenagers, in the last week, have you complained about your teachers, your school, your team, your coach? Workers, in the last week, have you complained about your job, your coworkers, the customers? Retirees, in the last week, have you complained about how many doctor's appointments you have to go to and why your body does not work the way you want it to? We have a hard time accepting our circumstances. And yet, this is the zone that God has placed in our life to operate within. And if we choose to accept them, how does that affect us? How does that affect those that are around us? So as we jump into this, let's go into verse number 2. And the Lord was with Joseph. I love that. Okay? Difference between Judah and Joseph. It says that Judah went down and hung out with Hira. Joseph was hanging out with the Lord. I just love that. That's the difference. First question of the night. How much do you hang out with God? I mean, can you actually claim that you do? Can you actually claim that you have a relationship with him? And yet here it is that God was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man. And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. This is absolutely amazing. You know what most of us, how we respond? We choose to pout. And instead of pouting, Joseph chose to thrive in the circumstances that God placed him in. And you say, well, wait a minute, this all comes back to his brothers and his third cousins, or however far removed they are, and they were in the deal of selling him, so this is all on them. Don't you think that God was sovereign in all this situation? Don't you think that God had a plan? And if you've read ahead, or if you've read it before, you see that God is actually setting him up in a position to be able to save his family from famine. To save his family from suffering, from dying off because they don't have enough food. This is the beauty of God's plan. God is sovereignly involved, and he chose, instead of pouting, to thrive. Joseph chose service over rebellion. Joseph chose to be chosen over being a victim. And you say, well, what do you mean by chosen? What happened back when he was a young man and where he got even more hated by his brothers? What happened? In the night he had a dream, right? He had this dream that he was in the middle, and there was these different examples or illustrations of it, but the point came down to it that he would be bowed down to by his family. He would be, in essence, served by his family, and they would acknowledge him being lifted up over them. And yet that's what he's coming back to here, is I'm going to embrace what God has presented to me. Something is coming out of this. I have hope for the future. And if we are a Christian here and we're in our circumstances, we understand that we've got hope for our future. And so that should just totally change our perspective right here. As human beings on this earth, as sanctified ones, as Christians, we should be totally different. And as it jumps into this, it mentions that he's a prosperous man. And he's just totally involved in what's going on. He's accepting the situation that's happening in his life. And it's just amazing in how this builds, this progresses. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. Listen, if we see here, Joseph is accepting his circumstances, but how does accepting our circumstances and living right within them, how do they affect other people? Other people get to see the presence of God in our lives as they are affected by it. Let's simplify this. If Grace Baptist Church decided to not complain this is big. To not complain about living in Illinois for the rest of the year. Do you think people would start to notice? Wait, I was discussing how Illinois was so wretched. Yeah, I understand that, but God put me here, and he's got a mission for me. My family's here. I said, yeah, your mom and dad's in the church, so therefore, yeah, all excited. That's the reason why you came to Illinois. I'm sorry, Mom and Dad, you're not the reason why I came to Illinois. God had a family here for me to come and be a part of, and to minister to, and to minister in, and to be ministered to. And he brought me to a place where everybody's leaving to do his mission, because people still need to get saved. See, that's crazy. No, it's extraordinary. It's awesome. God is good. Now let's go get more people to be a part of his mission in Taylorville, Illinois, in Pana, Illinois, in Hewittville, Langleyville, Morrisonville, fill in the blank, Tovey. There's too many little towns to be able to cover them all. I'm sorry if I forgot you, but you know who you are. And God has given us an extraordinary mission to go out and to reach into all these people because God still works in this place. God still works in Egypt, in Potiphar's house, as Joseph is a slave in the home. And he rises up and he does what he needs to do to where Potiphar started to notice, and he notices that God is working in his life. That is beautiful. And in verse 4 it says, and Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had he put into his hands. So literally Potiphar let him steward the entire house. And it came to pass from the time that he had made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not he had, save the bread which he did eat, and Joseph was a goodly person and well favored. So you even go back to, listen, this is so interesting, how Potiphar has literally handed everything over to Joseph to be able to steward, to watch over, to administrate, to keep track of all the people, the other slaves that are there, and all the food. The only thing that Potiphar was concerned about was the food he ate. Do you have that much trust in any individual? I mean, some of us struggle with trusting our spouses. What did you just spend? I know you went to Goodwill today, but that's been the 54th time this week. I'm a little concerned. But do you imagine, what weight has been placed in his hands? And listen, you're going to get it here pretty soon. Joseph is going to understand that weight that's been placed in his hands, and he's accepted that. He's operating within his zone. He's in his lane. And he's just enjoying all that God gives him. Have you been operating within your zone? Have you been accepting your circumstances? You know, the interesting thing about accepting our circumstances is that sometimes there's some options that arise in our circumstances that could change the entire situation. And so when you come into the second point, in the rest of the passage here, we see that we need to accept our circumstances without accepting every option. You say, well, what do you mean? I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you've had your child and you're trying to do laundry, or you're trying to build something, or whatever it might be. So you find a place to keep your child. Like, have you ever gotten those little walls that you could fold up and you put them around your child? You throw a bunch of toys in there. Have you ever done that? It's not child abuse, by the way, okay? It's acceptable. It's fine. And they're not running out into the street, okay? That's helpful. But you know, as you're watching your child and as you're looking over your child has an opportunity and free will to be able to operate within the zone that you've created for the child. Sometimes our children don't operate, or they don't operate in a very discerning manner. And they see new options that come into their view, and those toys that they've been playing for the last 30 seconds are not exciting anymore. And all of a sudden they see a worm rise from the ground. And you know what they do? They go and enjoy that worm, whether squishing it through their fingers, sticking it into their mouth. Now, most of us would be, yeah, you're all grossing out. See, I'm trying to, keep you awake here. All right, so as you see that, what do? Now, if you're Josh Clayton, you say, go, 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 go. No. If you're some people, you say, no, get that out of your mouth. Play with your toys, for crying out loud. This is the options that I'm giving you, not every option that comes before you. And we go off in this dialogue with our children, and they have no idea what we're saying to them. But yet we have a lot to communicate of don't eat worms. We all know how far that goes, right? You say, why are you using this illustration? Because all of a sudden there's a different option that comes up within his sphere, within his zone. As he's stewarding this household, this option comes up, and he's got to decide whether he's going to jump on it or whether he's not. Not every option is wise. As we jump into this, we go into verse number 7. And it says, "And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph." So Potiphar's wife, she's looking at Joseph, and she says, "Lie with me." Problem. Hasn't Joseph's family dealt with too much of this already? It says in verse 8, "But he refused and said unto his master's wife, Behold, my master wotteth not what is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he had to my hand." So this is where I told you earlier, where Joseph has understood the weight of all that's been placed in his hands by Potiphar, but he not only has this understanding of what Potiphar is presenting to him, he has an understanding of what God's presenting to him. We go on, and it goes in verse 9, "There is none greater in the house than I. Neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. You're not mine, you're his. I can't have you." He says, "How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" He's literally laying it out for him. And she should just say, "You're right. I'm sorry." But he's saying, listen, I've been given everything to manage, and I am at the top of this household underneath Potiphar, and you're wanting me to do this, but this is great wickedness. This is great evil. I cannot be a part of this. This might be an option, but this is against God. I can't do it. But does it stop there? "And it came to pass, as she spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie by her or to be with her. And it came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business." Listen, let's revisit that last verse here, okay? When you're understanding verse 10, it says that she came to him day after day. Can you imagine how persistent she is being with him? And yet he has to stay on track. Do you know how many excuses he could give to jump into this option that's been presented to him? Well, I've done so much for Potiphar. I deserve this. He's saying, no, you don't. But yet, what kind of justifications do we give ourselves when we want what we want? When the lust of the eyes is in front of us, when the lust of the flesh is in front of us, when the pride of life is in front of us, and yet we tend to give in. And just because it's consistent temptation, it doesn't mean that this is what God wants for our lives. Can you imagine praying for something like this and saying, well, God, if it doesn't go away, then I'm finally going to give in? Is that an excuse if it just keeps coming? Well, God, take this away from me. Well, it hasn't, so therefore maybe he wants this for me. Have you ever heard somebody talking about God's will in that situation? I've been praying about this. It's sin, but man, I just keep thinking that God's leading me in this direction, and you're like, what are you doing? Where are you going? Stop. Remember the good counseling. Stop. Quit. Have you ever been there just begging an individual to quit going down the path that they are going, and then they use even God to excuse what they're doing in their sin? And you say, how can somebody do that? People do it all the time. And just because it's a consistent temptation, it doesn't mean that means, well, it must be right for me, so I better go after it. No. Listen, what does God tell us? He says that there is always a way of an escape for us in every single temptation. Listen, these temptations are common to man. It's all the time. It's happening on a daily basis, in a moment-by-moment basis. These temptations are happening, but we have an escape route. We don't have to give in, and yet this is exactly what he does. He says, listen, I've got an option here, but that is not an option that I can have. This is not God's option. This is fleshly option. I can't follow after this. God has put this life in front of me to live for him, not for me. God first. And so that's where it comes in verse 11. You know, when we say no to temptation, it doesn't always make it an easy street for us. Because he's been saying no, 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 no all this time, and yet she just keeps on going, but it progresses. So he went in the house to do his business. He just kept working. Do you know, in that moment, you could have said, well, can you imagine this for a second? When you have all this temptation coming at you, you could say, well, I'm just going to give up on working. I'm just not going to work as hard. I'm going to back out of this situation because all these temptations are in front of me. But you know what? He overcame that and says, despite the temptations, because I know that they're always going to be there. Because we can't put ourselves into a bubble and block out all of the temptations. We can't do this for our kids either. We can't do this for grandchildren either. They're going to happen. He says, this is life. So what does he do? He keeps doing what God has put him in place to do, and to do his business. And there was none of the men of the house there within. Danger zone. This is where I start seeing the orange cones come up. And she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand and fled and got him out. He ran. Smart move. How fast do we respond in saying no to our temptation? What if he would have just lingered for a little while longer? What if he would have thought about it? No, it says that he fled. And that's not a cowardly situation here. This is a courageous situation where he got out of it. But yet it came to pass when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and was fled forth, that she called unto the men of her house and spake unto them, saying, see, he hath brought in Hebrew unto us to mock us. He came in unto me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. And it came to pass when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled and got him out. And she laid up his garment by her until his Lord came home. And so all of a sudden she's turned the tables against him. It's no longer Joseph running away from the situation. It was supposedly Joseph that got her into the situation, and now she's the victim. This mean follower of God. She goes to the Lord of the house. She spake unto him according to these words, saying, The Hebrew servant which thou hast brought unto us came in unto me to mock me. And it came to pass, as I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled out. And it came to pass, when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spake unto him, saying, After this manner did thy servant to me, that his wrath was kindled. Now we can sit here and we can question Potiphar about how he could have just gone and talked to Joseph. Why didn't he just take a few moments? And yet God was using this man to bring about another part of his plan. Even the quick fleshly nature of Potiphar to get to this point where all of a sudden he throws Joseph into jail. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound. And he was there in the prison. How unfair. God, I operated within my zone. I've been thrown into slavery by my own family, by my own kin. And yet here I am. And yet he doesn't do that. What does he do? He turns around, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison. And whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. Doesn't this blow your mind? Instead of jumping into the victim mentality that we so quickly jump into, man, that is our go-to anymore. I'm a victim. Everybody's against me. And yet Joseph jumps right back into it, operating within the zone that he didn't even deserve. And yet this is exactly what God is doing with him, for him, through him, to get him to the point where he takes care of his family. The ones who sold him into slavery. Man. This is a bit overwhelming in the amount of things that you're thinking about and pondering the questions, and yet it's all God's plan and how he's working. And this is exactly what we need to come in and realize. In our own zone, God must be doing something. God must be working. Because he is. You go in the last verse there. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him. And that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. So again, he comes back to the point where the prison keeper wasn't even doing his job anymore. Joseph was doing it for him. Well, was he getting paid? Doesn't matter. Joseph just jumped right to it. He did what needed to be done, and he prospered. He brought glory to God in the midst of a crazy situation that he did not deserve. And so that's, again, where we come back to. Listen. Temporary suffering does not nullify God's working in our lives. It's not gone. He's still at work with us. So think about it. Joseph is thrown into all these situations, accepts his circumstances, accepts his circumstances without taking all of the options, because he wants to glorify God. How are we doing? I tell you what, I struggle with this too, because when I was asking you about all the complaining that happens, I do it myself. But you know, if instead we step back and said, God, you brought me here. You put me here. You put me with these people. You put me with these coaches, with these teachers, with these coworkers, with these doctors, with these politicians. You put me with these to be able to do what? To operate within my zone, choosing what only will glorify God no matter what happens. Are we ready to do that? November, there's an election coming up. What if you don't get your way? What if in January this dreaded law comes into action about just letting people out? And there's some crazy things that these people would be able to do in order to get back out on the streets. You say, well, why arrest them anyway? What if it happens? What if Coach doesn't do something that you want him to do, or he doesn't treat you the way that you think that you should be treated? What if the teacher gives you an assignment that you don't really like? Kids, what if your parents tell you to do something that you don't really want to do? What about your boss and how we respond to that? And what if they call us to do something, or call you? I love my boss. What if they call you outside of your comfort zone? What if they call you to do something that your job doesn't really define you to do? How do we respond? Well, if they're calling you to do sin, you say no. That's the option that we don't take. But if I can glorify God with what God puts in front of me, then the shock value, the glory, goes to Him alone. And we could start singing praise. God, thank you for bringing us to Illinois. I can't wait to live here for the rest of my life praising you and glorifying you. But you know what? If you take me to Timbuktu, cool beans, let's go. And God, I will glorify you in Timbuktu. I will glorify you in Somalia. I will glorify you in Hewitttville. I will glorify you in Taylorville High School. I will glorify you in my doctor's office. I will glorify you at the election poll. I will just glorify you in whatever position that you put me in, because all glory needs to go to you anyway, because God, you brought me here. You have a purpose for me, and I've got hope beyond this life because I'm just on a missions trip. I'm going home soon. Because I decided to follow Jesus.